What was the greatest grace St. Ignatius received in his life? How did St. Ignatius respond to some near death experiences? What was plan A in Ignatius's life, and what happened to that plan? This and more we will learn on this episode 6 of St. Ignatius of Loyola, Getting to Know Him. So today, I thought of an acronym that we could use to just help us remember. Somehow these acronyms just keep coming to mind. But for today, we're going to use JP2 death, or JP2 died. We know that that late Pope has already gone before us. So the J stands for Jerusalem, the P for pilgrimage, or Ignatius as a pilgrim. The 2 is really to wrap up the 2 signal graces that Ignatius received. There were 5 total. We mentioned 3 in the last episode, so we have the last 2 to mention. And finally, death, or died, to speak about the near-death experiences of St. Ignatius. So we won't go in that order, but JP2 died. Jerusalem, Ignatius as a pilgrim, the 2 signal graces, and death, his response to death. So the 2 graces Ignatius spoke about, the final 2. One of them was that Ignatius from time to time would have a vision of the humanity of Christ. He would see like a figure, which he said wasn't totally distinctive in terms of its parts, but it was like a white body that he would see. And he saw this, he said, from 20 to 40 times along the journey, when he was in Jerusalem, when he was in Padua, different places. And this brought him such consolation. He even said he had such confirmation in his faith that even if there were no scriptures and if he was never taught the faith, he would still believe in Jesus because of these visions. Pretty powerful. And then the final grace we're going to talk about is pretty much the greatest grace he received. We had asked this question initially. So he'd finished praying while he was in Manresa. He had gone to the Church of St. Paul, came out of the church. There was a river nearby. It's called the Cardinal River. He sat by the river and he was looking out, and he said he didn't really have a vision, but like the eyes of his understanding were opened up. And he had this great understanding and a kind of enlightenment, you would say, of many things, including of faith and letters. And this was something that brought him such deep consolation that he says, in all of the 62 years of his existence at the time he was dictating this autobiography, nothing in his life that he had ever experienced before then and until now could equal the gift that God gave him in this moment by the river Cardinal, in this opening of his understanding. Quite amazing. So as Ignatius continues to tell his story, he speaks about 3 moments where he was near death and how he responded to these experiences. So one of the first times he got really sick and he was near death, and a thought came into his mind that he was just. And he immediately fought against this thought, trying to remember, some of the sins of his life. And he was saying that He even had a harder time trying to fight against that thought than the pain of the fever that he was experiencing. Well, afterwards, when he came out of this near death experience, and there were some people, some ladies who came to visit him, he sort of shouted at them, please, at any time they find him near death, that they should remind him of all his offenses against the Lord. So that's one experience he mentions. And then a second time, I think he was traveling from Venice to Italy on a boat, and there was a tempest. And so people were not sure they would make it. And he began to examine his life. Now, at this particular time, he didn't feel sort of any sense of guilt for sin or any sense of condemnation. But what he says he felt was regret, because he felt this deep regret for not using the gifts and the graces that God had bestowed on him. So this was his second near-death experience. First was around sin, second time was around a general regret. Third time was in 1550. So this is just 6 years before he died in 1556. He was very sick. He was again at the point of death. And at this time, the more he thought about death, he actually experienced deep joy and consolation. That he had so much joy and consolation thinking about death that he actually had to stop himself from thinking about it because he felt such great joy. Now, maybe we ourselves can begin to think about the prospect of the day we will leave this world, you know? Someone said, one thing is guaranteed, that all of us will end up 6 feet under. That's kind of a dire looking thing. But really, what are the thoughts and imaginations that come to your heart when you think about this reality of death? And maybe St. Ignatius can help us through this. So I'd like to say a few words about St. Ignatius the pilgrim. And so now at this point in time, Ignatius is making his way on a journey. He really wants to spend time in Jerusalem. And so we hear about this pilgrimage that he is on, and in some of the highlights of things that happened to him as he was on this pilgrimage. Now, one of the things Ignatius greatly desired was to have total trust in God for the journey, to put all of his faith, all of his hope, and all of his love in God, right? And sometimes along the journey, there were people who wanted to go along on pilgrimage with him. And at some point, he kind of, relied on this person when he was hungry. And when the person fell, he picked the person up. And he, he thought to himself that, you know what, these affections that I have and these thoughts, I need to place it entirely in God. And so he came up with this idea of traveling alone without any provisions whatsoever, so that he could entirely depend on God's providence on the journey. Now, if you know any Jesuits, you know that as novices, many of us do a pilgrimage, just like St. Ignatius did. A lot of times you're given like a one-way bus ticket to somewhere, and you're to beg your way back home. This is sort of an imitation of Ignatius on his pilgrimage. A couple of other little stories. There's a lot of little things that happen along the way, but he does mention that once he was with a mother and a daughter. They got on a boat in order to be able to travel to Italy to get the blessing of the Pope before they went on to Jerusalem. And this mother and daughter, the daughter actually dressed up, the mother dressed up the daughter as a boy. You can imagine why. And they went on this ship. And after they got on the ship, they went together into a city, and some people met them, invited them to come in. They had a big celebration. There was some drinking and all that. Ignatius went to sleep in his quarters, and at night he heard a loud scream. And when he came in, he saw that some men were trying to take advantage of this mother and the daughter, and he screamed, do they need to suffer through this? you know so you could see his desire to protect and to help others. Well, the mother and daughter eventually went on along the way on their journey, and Ignatius talks about different circumstances. Sometimes people helped him on the journey. Sometimes he didn't have food to eat for so long that when he woke up one morning and was walking along the way, somebody saw him and screamed. And Ignatius says maybe it's because he was discolored and he was so emaciated from not having food for such a long time. Well, eventually, St. Ignatius was able to get into a boat that took him to the Holy Land in Jerusalem. And right before they got to the Holy Land, somebody, Diego Manes, recommended that everybody take some time for silence. And Ignatius mentions that as they saw the city and the holy places, the place where Jesus walked on the face of the earth, he said he felt, and all the people felt, a kind of consolation that was unnatural, that he thought. It was such a deep, deep consolation for being close to the very place where Jesus walked. So Ignatius, got the blessing from the Pope, Adrian VI, and then they made their way to Jerusalem. And as we mentioned, they were just so deeply consoled arriving in Jerusalem, right? This was Ignatius's great desire. His plan A was really to go to Jerusalem, to spend his time there in the very places where Jesus lived and walked, and also to help souls there. Well, Ignatius arrives, and of course, most of the Holy Land was being run by the Franciscans, as it is still today. And so he got there and he tried to inquire if he could stay and remain in Jerusalem, spend his life there. But the Franciscans there, they kind of told him, you know what? So many Christians who are here have been killed or have been in prison because there were a lot of conflicts and wars at the time. So it wasn't really safe for anybody to stay there. Well, he still kind of stood firm and wanted to be there, waited for the provincial, the person, the head there to come back. And the person came back, received him warmly, but told him the same thing. It's too dangerous for anybody to live there and to stay there. It's kind of sad that that has been a region of a lot of conflict even to this very day. But in either case, Ignatius tried to insist, and they told him, you know what, we have authority from the Holy See, from the Pope himself, to excommunicate anybody who does not obey our, this instruction. And so Ignatius was convinced, and he just kind of forgot about that. So he had to scrap this plan A he had for his whole life to be there in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, when it got to evening, Ignatius had this thought that he wanted to go visit the Mount of Olives. And so he went there and he had a very consoling experience. Actually, the guards did not want him to go through because he went alone, but he bribed them. He gave them the knife that he had so he could go through. And he spent time in prayer there, felt very consoled, decided to go to Bethpage, one of the cities mentioned in the scriptures as well. And then while he was there, he thought, you know what? I want to return to the Mount of Olives, because there is a stone to commemorate the place from which Jesus ascended into heaven. I've actually had the fortune of visiting there 3 years ago, and seeing that place in Jerusalem. But Ignatius wanted to go back to that spot around the Mount of Olives, and because he wanted, in his mind, he was thinking, was it his right foot that was imprinted or his left foot? So he wanted to go back to see what it was. And he got back to the guards again, and of course they refused to let him in, and he gave them the scissors that he had. This guy was kind of a very practical guy. Anyway, he went through and he was able to go in and experience some consolation. Meanwhile, they noticed he was gone, so they sent a search party to go find him. And of course, they were so upset when they saw him there, and they took him by the hand and just kind of grabbed him forcefully to take him back to the residence. And as that was happening, Ignatius actually, he said he saw the figure of Christ actually as he was being led, and he felt this kind of consolation in him even as this happened. So it's just a little bit as we continue the journey learning about St. Ignatius, getting to know him. If you have any comments, put it down in the comment section. And if you can, even try to answer those questions that we asked in the beginning, put down your answers there. But this is it for episode 6 of St. Ignatius of Loyola, Getting to Know Him. AMDG, blessing.